So thank you very much for inviting me back to the school for a homecoming in the presentation. And my talk today is about writing your research in English. And after I graduated from chemistry, I worked briefly as a chemist for about a year, and then I started my career in scientific publishing. And I worked firstly at a publisher for a few years before I changed my job and started working more closely with authors. Basically, I'm collaborating with them to make sure that whatever manuscript they prepare is well presented enough so that when they submit their draft paper to a journal, it will be good enough for the journal editor to decide to send this to the reviewer for review, instead of saying, oh, this is not well prepared and we should not bother the reviewer in looking at something that is not reasonably well prepared. And ideally, we want the reviewer to send back to us and to say that, oh, this story makes sense, and I think the science can be improved, or can be either improved or blah blah blah, and instead of telling us that no, your story doesn't make sense, I can't even understand what you're writing. So that has been the story that that has been what I've been doing over the past years, and so that's why I'm going through the story today on the on writing the research in English. And as for talking about research, we are researchers working on science. And I think when it comes to science, science is all about looking for fact. And I think, in fact, what we believe as fact changes over time. So, which is to say, decades ago, people believed that Earth is at the center of the universe, if not the solar system, and we also used to believe that the Earth is flat, but over time we get to know that we realize that what we used to believe is probably not right, and the fact here is something that is external to your belief or to what you think or to your preference, and eventually you'd have to succumb to that. You need to know that that is a fact, and you have to respect the fact instead of just upholding what you believe to be of a personal preference on or something of the like. And when it comes to research, I define research as a asymptotic quest, which means basically, if we have this as the fact, and if we have this axis as science, research is sort of a endeavor that goes this way. So basically, our understanding of the fact can be way off in the beginning, and as we work further and harder, we get better and better understanding over time. And in fact, when we look back, we see that our understanding used to be so ridiculous, and probably as you advance to some level further ahead, when you look back, you see, it was way off back then. But I think that is how research works, and that is what I define as asymptotic, and that has been my understanding of science and research. So, in terms of research, when you want others to know what you are looking at, what you are trying to figure out, these are the things that you want to figure out yourself, and you want others to know that you are talking about these things, and you need to clearly both tell yourself clearly that what is your purpose, that what are you studying, why is it important, how do you plan to figure things out, and why is your plan going to work, and what are the eventual findings, and what do you interpret from your findings. And you have to figure these out firstly to yourself, and then you need to communicate to others, and basically you need to tell others what the entire story. So in terms of telling others, that means you really need to communicate clearly and make sure you are writing effectively. And when it comes to writing, I actually actually what comes to me is often this trinity. Like you write something and you try to revise it, and sometimes translation also gets in the way. Actually, for us, a lot of us here, when you speak English as your native language, this does not appear at all, essentially. But a lot of the authors that I work for, they have Chinese Mandarin as their native language, so oftentimes like translation can get in the way. But in terms of translation, from my experience, I believe that firstly, I recommend that the writer needs to try his best to minimize the translation, minimize the disturbance that he gets from the translation. But on the other hand, it doesn't really matter if you are writing science in some other language, but it ultimately comes down to clarity. Make sure that you are, like, if you're writing a scientific paper, it doesn't matter if it's written in English or written in some other language, as long as it is written clearly enough to make sure that others can understand your story, and then that's fine enough. And the complication that arises from translation is only that when you write in English, you have a set of conventions, and when you write in some other language, you may have another set of conventions to make things, to help with clarity. And these conventions can be different. And that's when you can receive complications from translation, because you might be carrying one set of conventions from your native language into English, and then when the conventions are fighting with each other, you end up with having your convention of another language interfere with the convention that should help in English. But everybody improves over time. It's just a matter of experience and practice. And in fact, I've been talking about translation for like the past for a minute or two. Actually, even when there is no translation involved, that is, within the same language, we sometimes get into these kinds of situations. And these two pictures are my favorites. So we can be thinking of different things, and we end up writing or saying the same thing. And we can be looking at the same thing, and we try to express the same thing, and we end up saying different things. So that means even within the same language, we might end up creating problems. So it does not necessarily have to do with translation. And there we have, since we're talking about research, so we need to figure out writing about research is different from our daily conversation, because when you write research, you have to make sure you are talking about facts, and you are being highly organized. You are putting everything into context, and you have to make sure that your agreement is never compromised. If you say something, if you say A gives rise to B, or A equals B, and then everything in your entire paper or entire thesis everything has to corroborate that thesis you give. Basically, you cannot create anything that contradicts itself. And when it comes to these points, clarity is essential. make sure you remember that. So you have to make sure that you have agreement for everything that you write, and you have to make sure everything is written clearly. And with that, that is how you connect your thesis, basically research, with English, which is writing. And so from this slide on, brace for impact, we are going to take off on a number of technical details that I have summarized over the years, basically working on the writings of others. So a large part that I have been emphasizing, which is actually basically half of this talk, is about agreement. And one major item on agreement is that you need to use pronouns correctly. And when it comes to pronouns, like these are some of the very common pronouns that we use, like there are personal, possessive, demonstrative, or definite and indefinite and relative pronouns, and these are the pronouns that we use. And later I will show a number of examples of correct and incorrect usage. And later on, I will be talking about plurality, and you generally we prefer singular forms, but you need to make sure. But sometimes we might intentionally write things that are plural to make sure that we can avoid problems. So let's move on to some examples. So here, you see that when you have a plural noun, you have to make sure it is referred to by a plural pronoun. So for example, this sentence, you have the pig, and the it is referring to the pig. There's no way for you to mistake. So that means you have no ambiguity. This matching exclusive within this entire sentence. So you're being explicit and not ambiguous. And for example, this is a bad sentence, badly constructed sentence. The newly introduced law is useless if everybody is dismissing them. Either you write laws, the plural form, or you write it. Otherwise, like if I see a word them here, I try to look for a plural entity in the sentence, which I do not find. This is how I mean what I mean by there is too few and you are not being explicit. On the other hand, let's look at this sentence. The results were divided into the high group and the low group, and since many devices had high air distiller, the speed is mostly within this range or even lower. Which range? Right? So this is what I mean by the sentence is it actually is not being unambiguous. It's being ambiguous because there are too many things that are matched to the same pronoun. And a rule of thumb is that when you do not know, if you are clear enough, you just spell it out. For example, for this sentence, you have intensive food production reduces soil organic matter after harvest. In addition, poor management of crops and animal farming can also lead to this situation. But what situation are we talking about? Like, you can improve this sentence very easily by simply spelling out what exactly is going on. Poor management can also decrease soil organic matter. Also, this is the situation that we are talking about. So, and also there are situations like if you read this sentence, you notice that there is a plural entity and there is a plural pronoun. It might seem okay, right? But if you read carefully enough, this doesn't really make sense here. In Africa, the strong and common voice of the African Union or something is to ask other countries not to interfere in their internal affairs. So if you have this plural pronoun is going to point right over there to other countries. why does the African countries ask other countries not to meddle with their internal affairs? This doesn't make sense, right? Actually, what the sentence here is trying to say is that the Union is trying to ask other countries not to interfere with the internal affairs of African countries. So this is actually the African countries. Like the situation here describes a scene where if you write it wrong, nobody else is obliged to figure this out for you. That means you have to make sure that others can easily understand. And you have to make sure by writing things clearly and without a mistake. And we went through pronouns just now, and we are going to go through some antecedents and the references, and which covers basically these kinds of words. And they are going to be tightly connected to the writing of clauses. Like for which and that, we're going to cover the restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, and we're going to go through these items like in later slides. So for example, for the which and that, the difference between which and that, there are different conventions for British and American English, and normally the style that I use is I use that for restrictive clauses, and I use which for the non-restrictive clauses. For example, these are the example sentences like this is a restrictive sentence with a restrictive adjective clause, like the that modifies everything before, like and in terms of referring to this as restrictive, it means that if you take this part of the information away, then this sentence is useless to you. But on the other hand, the which clause here is the different. Like if you take this away, this which is only adding up to information to your sentence. You still want this sentence here, but it doesn't matter if you do not really have this part. You're just wanting to report more information here. So this is the difference between which and that. We're going to look at another on the next page. Like they developed a series of box ligands that improve reactivity. So here is what you are trying to emphasize. And for this sentence, you don't really care like what exactly is on the box ligand. You're only trying to say that, oh, they develop some ligands, and we try to describe the ligands a bit further. And that is the difference between the restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, according to my understanding from experience. And you also need to pay attention to which, because the term which can be highly promiscuous. Like when you read this sentence, the northern section has a rocky coastline, whereas the southern section has a sandy coastline, which may have a fundamental importance on fishery development. Are you talking about the north, or are you talking about south, or are you talking about everything altogether? So in this case, I would recommend that we simply spell it out. For example, like this. So stopping here, and the coastline pattern may have a strong impact on local fishery development. Or we may actually put both of which here as well. And then we know that we are actually referring to everything, basically the first half of this entire sentence. And in this way, we avoid this promiscuity problem. For example, this is another example of this promiscuity. The strong coordination gave multiple pattern hierarchical structures in STP, which showed notable improvements in mechanical strength, shape memory, and hydrophobicity. So when we parse the sentence, we can see this which can refer to either STP or structures or even coordination. But if coordination is far enough, which is basically not going to refer to that. And here we do not know exactly whether if this is referring to STP or structures. Or actually, you can argue that only STP can show improvement, your structure cannot show lexically. No structure can show improvement in mechanical strength. But this is simply what you're requiring your reader to do the extra work for you, because you didn't prepare a sentence that does not create that forking understanding. So ideally, we want to avoid the situation like this. And you need to properly position your parts. Like, this sentence is simply hilarious. We need a worker to take care of a cow that does not smoke or drink. Right? So the real antecedent is the worker, but it's too far away from the modifier. So if we actually rewrite the sentence, we can say we need to take care of a cow. We need to take care of a cow by hiring a worker that does not smoke or drink. So basically, for the antecedents we just mentioned, and for the pronouns we begin with, we need to be explicit and ambiguous, and we make sure they are nearby, and eventually we make sure everything is in agreement. This is the ultimate. And we just mentioned some of the we mentioned like two subject before, and now we're going to go through this subject verb object agreement. Basically the same pattern that happens in every single sentence. So we still begin with examples. Like, this is clearly a sentence that is correctly written. The formation of something is pivotal. So you have a singular term, and then you have a singular verb. And the below is a completely garbled, a completely wrong sentence. Like, you have a plural verb, you have a plural entity that is followed by a singular verb, and you have a singular entity that is followed by a plural verb. And actually this sentence has even more problems. Say you have, if we are going to write this correctly, we have to write nearly a century, well, 100 years. If you use has, then it has to be nearly a century has elapsed, and the synthesis of DBU, the synthesis has only emerged. And actually, the problem with this later part is that the synthesis cannot emerge as a building block. It's this thing, your molecule that can emerge as a building block. But that is actually on malapropos that we will cover later on in the later slides. So the key point here is that you really need to find the real subject to agree with, and you must not be mistaken. A common situation where you get mistaken is that you get fooled by proximity. Like here, you have the creates and enhances are immediate neighbors of the pi star orbital, which is singular. But actually, the real subject is the sigma star orbital and the pi star orbital. You have the two adding up together, which is plural. And the exact opposite is true for the next example. You have the syndrome that is the real subject, and so it is supposed to be is here because you have the syndrome is whatever. Instead of you are not talking about children. The rest of the sentence is talking about your syndrome, not about the children. And here is another example. The fact that he enjoys these ridiculous books, you're talking about the fact. The fact is perplexing. It's not the books are not perplexing. So you must not be fooled by proximity. And there is also a common situation where you can get very confused. Like, are you going to say the committee is or are making the decision? Because a committee has to be many people together in the same room, right? So there you have a conflict between the real meaning. If you think of the meaning, you have many people, you have to use a plural. And if you think of the word form, you have to use a singular, right? And then you have a conflict. Actually, if you go to the corpus, which is corpus of contemporary American English, you see that the usage is like this. I pulled this from the table. Like the singulars And there are people using the singular, and there are instances of the plural as well. And this can create a very serious confusion. Like normally, I think normally we should still stick to the singular because this is the singular word here. But you can actually be smart and get around this problem just by changing the construction of your sentence. Like if you write these words, it doesn't matter anymore. Like they can be plural, they can be singular, nobody can tell. Like because they have the same form, whether you have a singular word or a plural word as the subject. So in these cases, you might as well just change the way you write the sentence and get around the problem altogether. And now I'm going to also talk about modifiers. And there are also quite a number of problems with modifiers. And it still comes down to the key concept of agreement. Basically, if we look at the examples here, if you say there's a peak ranging from there 45 to 90, we are basically not going to have a peak like this wide, right? Basically, we're having a peak like there, and this peak is actually within a range, within this wide range. So this cannot be a modifier of the peak. This is a problem with this sentence. So for this sentence, for the second sentence is that after finishing the purification, the activity of the isolated compound was then studied. The problem is that finishing, here you're writing a clause here, so lexically the word finishing is modifying the activity. So but the activity cannot finish the purification. It is the researcher that actually does all the purification. So the sentence is not correct. For example, and we can see more examples here on this slide. Following the electronic measurements, each sample was collected. Basically, this is the same problem with the previous sentence. And the same situation here again. After washing, the membrane was incubated with a secondary antibody. The membrane cannot wash itself, but you can write a sentence in this way. Like after washing, the membrane was then washed. Oh well, actually you rephrase the sentence entirely. So you say that the membrane was washed and then incubated altogether. Or you can actually say after a wash, and then you do not leave a modifier for the membrane here. So basically, it's like for the opening part of the sentence, you use a none, not a gerund, because the gerund is going to act. This is going to act as a modifier for your subject. And these can be problems. These can be common problem with due to using or things alike. So I would advise avoid using these sentences unless you're pretty sure. And these examples are also problematic. Like reactions did not proceed cleanly with decomposition or no reactivity. Do you really have a reaction that can proceed cleanly with decomposition? That doesn't make sense. Like for this, it's also the trying here is a modifier to the crime, and the crime cannot try to conceal a blunder. So these are the sentences that are not grammatical. And also there are some set patterns that you need to memorize. You need to always write between and, from, to, and you should never write between to and from and. This is very common. These are common errors that I see from the writings of the authors that I work for. Basically, you need to memorize that. You need to be very mathematical here. You need to be, for example, if you have a preposition and you have the preposition working for different parts, and if you extract this part out, you can do this, or alternative, you can do that, and you should not mix and match. Make sure you have all the set patterns correct. And for the actually the parallel structures are sort of like the set patterns we just mentioned before. Like this is sort of like the set pattern. And the parallel structure here is that you can do multiple things at the same time, but you need to make sure that you are doing things correctly. For example, this is a situation where the first half looks sort of correct, but the second half cannot be properly merged with the first half. So you have the blood vessel branching into the branching into the muscle, and the later part is basically saying how the blood vessel branches into different parts of the artery. It's like either you have the vessel going into like becoming part of your muscle, or is the vessel itself become like branching or forking into like a river forking into different parts, like different parts of the artery. And then these cannot be parallel parts. So actually these are parallel to each other, but these four cannot be put together. Basically, if you want to talk about this in this way, you have to rewrite the sentence. And this is the right way to do it, is very mathematical. And these are even more impressive examples, like the soldier was injured once in ambush, once in the leg, and once in France. So you see, the sentence looks pretty good, but probably this is not what you're trying to say. And for this one, tasks to be coordinated include security, supplying water, and how to move trucks. So the meaning here is actually pretty good. And here we have the exact opposite. So here we have a noun, a phrase, and you have a clause here. So it looks like a totally hideous sentence. We want to avoid both of them. So we want to write good form, and we want to write good meaning. And for the second, balance, we're talking about balance. It's like the previous example of the security is like a sentence that is badly constructed. Like this sentence is sort of similar. Like we have the tissues separated and washed with a huge modifier and then collected. And we can actually try to not let the collected become a parallel entity of the first two. And then we say that the tissue were separated and washed with a huge modifier, and we just say before collection. And then this is not going to be something that we still have to keep an eye on after we read the first two. And this is what I call balancing your sentence. So we now have a summary of the first half of our of these experiences. Basically, it all comes down to agreement. And from my experience, I think grammatically, if you can get singularity and plurality right, you solve like 3/4 of your problem. And English is actually fairly friendly in this sense, because English is way more gender neutral than French or Spanish or language of this sort, because like we don't have a cat by default that is feminine, or a dog that is by default masculine. A cat is just a cat, a dog is just a dog. And we are less troubled with cases, because German, Russian, and these languages, they have complicated cases, like when you have a noun that is a subject, and that is a object, and they become different cases, and those will be complicated. In English, we don't have that much differentiation. And we must make sure that meanings will match. And so your goal is to write clearly enough that you do not require any specialized knowledge. Basically, if you write an organic synthesis paper, the reader does not have to know organic synthesis to understand what is going on, because you are using consistency and agreement to make sure that you write everything crystal clear, and the reader can only use nothing more than common sense to understand what is going on. And that is what I've been trying to do in my working with my authors, because they work in from aerodynamics to like soil sciences or geology or marine sciences. They work on everything, and I use nothing but common sense to rewrite their papers and help to clear things up. So we are now moving on to the second half of this summary, and there are a few scattered examples or notes to be taken. Like for the definite indefinite articles, this is particularly applicable for English ESL writers, because for example, in Mandarin and some other Asian languages, we just don't have the indefinite or definite articles. Like we don't have the difference between the cat or a cat, or like a cat is a cat. We don't have that kind of. We just don't have the word. We don't have the article in the language. But in fact, when you use the article in English, you notice that when you refer to something new, you use an indefinite article, and when you refer to something that is recurring, you use a definite article. And the same applies in this dimension as well. When you refer to something that is abstract, and for an abstract entity, you want to use an indefinite article. When you refer to something that is specific, use a definite article. But there are times when you have to resolve a conflict, and then you will need to figure out. Basically, when you need to figure out the conflict, you need to think in the minds of the natives. And there are even notes to be taken for the natives as well, because you need to think in the mind of your reader. Basically, if your reader thinks something is specific or something is new, and then you need to follow your reader's thought. Like think in the mind of your reader to figure out what exactly is the article that you're supposed to use for the word that you're writing. And there is another common problem is called the non-plague. For example, for like this sentence, what does it mean? If you read it, the prolongation of the existence of this temple is due to the solidity of its construction. I think maybe some student might write things in the thesis to show that, oh, I understand a lot. But in fact, he is saying nothing more than the temple has endured because it was solidly built. Like, it was very well built. So that's what we say. We really should eliminate all these bureaucracies and academies that has been made fun of by many really great writers. And actually, I encourage you to go to YouTube and search for George Carlin's very fun a talk that is by George Carlin that is very fun to listen to. He talks about how to speak English, basically making fun of all these situations. And the non-plague is also known as abstractitis, being hugely abstract. So these are the examples where you can break down all these none after none after none into snippets, like small pieces, cut into small pieces, like if you're going to serve a dish to your guest, you're not going to serve the entire lump. You're trying to cut into small pieces for your guest to eat more easily. Like for this example, the straw residue incorporation, you want to incorporate the straw residue. That's it. Just by cutting it a little bit, it's going to help. Like for the quality control group reports, actually it's the report for the quality control group, or something like in this case, lung cancer research project design. It's a project design for the research of lung cancer. Just by cutting a little bit will be helpful. And make sure you just try your best to cut into small pieces instead of writing nonce after nonce after nonce. Like even with only 2 nouns, you can create confusion. For this sentence, it could be, but this delay comes at the expense of VI corrosion. By only reading VI corrosion, we don't exactly know what is corroding what. So, in fact, what the author intended to mean was that this practice came at an expense. Basically, Vi is the iron, low valence iron is corroded at low pH, and the minerals cannot readily form. This actually, so this is the context of the entire story. So that means basically you need to break up the VI corrosion to show the entire story and to make sure that your reader can understand properly. And this is what I mean by writing clearly enough so that you don't require field-specific knowledge. And then your reader can basically only resort to common sense to understand what exactly is going on. And there are also cases where you have really bad word choice, like the representation represents, or a reasonable reason, and sometimes you write things like A of B of C of D. And like you can try your best to reconstruct your sentence and to make sure they don't look ridiculous. And there are also problems that are technically called non-sequitur, which has a big complicated definition here that I pulled from the dictionary, but I would condense this down to just simply a situation where you write nonsense, where people cannot really understand. Basically, when you're writing nonsense and people feel like this is the problem that you create. Let me give you some examples. Like, this is actually what I saw a while ago. This molecule is very high in energy because of its ring strain. However, the bonds in the molecule are rather inert. So what exactly is going on? It's actually this molecule is very high in energy because of its ring strain, and its reactivity can be further enhanced. So that is not, we're not saying that the bonds are inert. We're saying that the bonds can be made further, even more labile, right? So this is the rather inert here is creating nonsense, and for this sentence, it's like we just don't. It's just hard to understand. One fatal defect of this material is its low glass transition temperature, because of the addition of plasticizer. Like why are you saying that this has a problem because of something else? The fuller story is that because plasticizer is added into the material, and then to prepare add it to the native material to prepare this modified material. And when you spell it out, you see the connection between the plasticizer and the material. And then if you write it this way, you don't require your reader to understand, oh, actually this material contains plasticizer and requires the use of plasticizer in its preparation. And by writing this way, you don't require field-specific knowledge. You're only asking for common sense from your reader. And this is what is going to help in your writing. And when you have a complex argument, you tend to write nonsense way more easily than you have a simple statement. And we now come to some very things that will give a lot of face swamp to you. Like, this is a classic example. Malapropism is actually also called Bushism because George W. Bush is famously known for a lot of things that he say, like, they misunderestimated me. However, irregardless of the misunderestimation, we can still figure out what is he trying to say. So this is why these kind of problems tend to lurk and tend not to be noticed even after you repeatedly go through the same sentence. Like, did you notice that irregardless is a problem as well? Right? So another example that I actually came across is that when I was lucky to have my own wedding like many other bridals, seriously? Are you talking about bridals or are you talking about bride? So these are the things that will make your reader very confused. And there are also things you really need to pay attention to. Like if you write few, you are trying to tell others that you are talking about this is being next to none. Like this is really minimal. But if you're writing a few, that means you are saying that there are still a number of things they're over there. Similarly, if you say previously in your background, in your introduction section, you are essentially telling. Most likely you are going to tell, oh, somebody else did this before. And if you write proceeding, generally you tend to say, oh, this is what we did, or things like that. So you need to make sure you distinguish one thing from the other, and make sure that you write everything with agreement and you write everything clearly and consistently. And there are a number of other examples that are, I don't know if I should just call them entertainment, that I come across like on a daily basis. Like when I read a paper written by a surgeon, I am dissecting cerebral structures. Seriously? You want to dissect things from my brain? Right? And he is saying that his procedure is not really mimicking his method is not mimicking the procedure, but he is actually already mimicking. It's just maybe not representing well enough. And this is what I read from another paper. Like this molecule is toxic, highly toxic, and who exactly are you trying to kill, right? And for obtaining improved maximized yields, you can only improve yield or you can maximize yield. You cannot do both at the same time. And for example, this is almost like the a few distinguish this difference that I mentioned in the previous slides. If you say reduced dissection, that means you are still cutting, and if you say no dissection or advantage eliminates or obviates dissection of muscles, that means you're not cutting at all. So that means you are still cutting. And you need to make sure that you are saying what you intend to mean. And there are even more examples, like the daily excreta was obtained from the literature. Well, your literature smells really badly. And actually, there's one even more problem, even another problem in this. Excreta is only supposed to be plural. So this is not, so actually the correct sentence here is the amount of daily excreta was obtained from literature. That is what you obtain. The literature is giving you the data, not the whatever stinky species, stinky entity. And your reaction cannot really be incompatible. It's only the reagents being incompatible with each other. And this is what I wrote from an essay written by a Chinese writer. Like, nobody in English really says strong brown, so this has to be a, and for this, it's like, this is something that I come across quite often. A minimum score of more than 40. So either you have a score that is more than 40, or you have a score that is of a minimum of the 40. And this is also something that I came across. You use acetonitrile as solvent. Actually, you have benzaldehyde in acetylnitrile. So it is 0.1 molar benzaldehyde in acetylnitrile. You must not. You're right. You're using the wrong preposition. And speaking of preposition, actually, preposition can create a lot of problems as well. So let me give you a few examples. If we say deeply engaged to the job, that means, oh, the job is about to get married with me. And my mom gets mad about me. She really loves me. Or, for example, what are you good for? That is insulting, isn't it? So the right way to use here, we should I am deeply engaged in my task, in my project, and mom got mad at me for, right? And I am good at some skills that I learned in the lab. And this is a common problem for speakers that do not speak English as their native language. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the tense. The tense here. Actually, when we say, for example, when we write things in past tense and the present tense, they can be both grammatical, but we can actually mean totally different things. And if you go to the ACS guideline, you see that simple past tense is for what you did, and the present tense is for what is already considered common knowledge. And for the discussion, it can be of either. But if you go to the Wiley guideline, they want the same. Basically, Wiley and ACS wants the same for what is done by you, and they have the same for what is considered common sense. But they have a conflict for the discussion. Basically, when you discuss or when you analyze or when you give an argument of what you think, Wiley wants present tense completely, but ACS wants, like ACS is, as long as you're consistent with yourself, it doesn't matter. So that means you really need to check the style guide and of the journal that you're submitting to, or you need to check the subject area preference. Like for ACS, we kind of like have this. We can use past tense for general statement that is acceptable for ACS journals. But for example, when I when I edited something in geology, the author and the reviewer basically trashed me for writing past tense on discussion because he thinks everything must be present tense. So the key point here is that even if you do a change that is completely grammatical, like if you say something, if you change the tense from present to past, that can be completely grammatical, but that changes how your attitude to what you're saying, and you change the way the others think, how you're thinking about the subject. So that is very subtle here. You really need to make sure that even when you're staying completely grammatical, you need to make sure that you write completely consistently and by complying to the style guide. And we just talked about the fact and deed, basically what you did and what is already common knowledge, and the conflict we just covered is about the deed and basically what you did and what you think, right? So like when you talk about experimental results, that is what you did. And when you talk about what you think, basically your analysis, that is what you believe, and they can both involve words that can appear in past tense or as past participles. So there you can create confusion. There is a possibility for confusion. So basically, these are a lot of the words that are commonly used for either purpose. But there are also words that can create confusion, like what do you think? What do you say?
something shows, or something? Do you say the data we showed the data, or the data shows something, or how do you categorize show or appear or review? These words can be applicable in either category. So what I do here is that I basically restrict, like these can both be good. So what I do here is just to restrict these kind of words only to one category. Or I can do it in a even more drastic manner. I ban the word use of that altogether. So I use everything else but these words that can fall into either category. So I avoid this problem altogether to make sure that others will not misunderstand my attitude. And we now come to the style of writing in terms of succinctness. Like these are all like you don't really have to write these. Like if anything not that is critical but not important, like why do you have local location? Why don't you just write regional geography? And in the field of, I commonly just chop that off because it doesn't give you any other any useful information. And unless you really want to emphasize process is generally included in whatever you do. And for this, it's just like just invites questions. You see, why would you study carelessly, and how do you import something that is domestic? It just invites questions. And these are common problems in all these legalese or academies. We just covered that. The what was it? The building was solidly. The temple endured the elongation of the temple, or you remember that experience, that example. The elongation of the temple was simply a matter of saying that the temple was built very solidly. So this is the succinctness, something you need to enforce in effective writing. And for this legalese and problem, you can simply go to another talk by George Carlin on soft language. Basically, by being people soften their language by adding all those useless modifiers. But by using all those modifiers, they also make their expression way less effective and that basically undermine their communication. And we can also mention a little bit on the punctuation. And this actually comes a little bit to editorial jargon. Like this is the comma before the end here is called the Oxford comma, and that is very important. If you drop that, the entire latter part becomes a modifier of the former part. And we actually also went through this as well, and this is actually this is also relevant to this situation. And when speaking of punctuation in your writing, I just want to introduce a little bit, like when you write, if you write a multiplication mark, you're not supposed to write this asterisk. You're supposed to write a proper multiplication. And if you write a degree symbol, you're not supposed to insert some random Asian symbol over there. And also, if you have there is a distinct complete set of differences, like between hyphen, n dash, hyphen, n dash, m dash, and minus mark. And actually, you can only see the difference between these in the Arial font and the Times New Roman, which is adopted by ACS. Previously, they have now changed to Arnold Pro, and by Wiley, they are still sticking to Arial. but you can't really see the difference here in color bright. Actually, this is an n dash, that is an n dash of this length, and this is a minus symbol. So -5 and from 12 to 13 to 34, these are different symbols. You are supposed to write those correctly, and you are not supposed to write hyphen in either case. And you need to make sure that your writing does not invite questions like all these have different connotations. Like basically, if you say I don't care or I don't mind, that can invite different feelings. And are you seriously trying to thank somebody, or are you trying to say I hope I could, but I shouldn't, but I wouldn't? These are all problems. And it comes down to the take-home message that when you write something down on paper, you are inviting somebody else to read and to reconstruct what you're thinking about. And you do not have all the auxiliaries that you can have when you speak in person to somebody else. Like, because when you speak to somebody else, you have your tone, you have facial expression, you have gesture, and everything else to help you. And the vocabulary or the sentences that you use are only part of your entire toolkit. But when you write things down, others cannot see you, and others can only try to reconstruct your message from the writing. And what's even worse is that if you misuse your grammar, then other people, the reader, will find a hard time to figure out what exactly are you trying to say. And also remember the case that when we are even using grammar correctly, like when we are switching from present tense to past tense, we actually switch our attitude. Even we actually might not be wanting to change our attitude, but your reader is going to think that you have a different attitude to what you're saying, which is the problem. And if you want to read more about effective writing, there are a few books that you might look at. These are about English, basically, and these are more about science. Basically, in this book, it divides the entire book to two parts. The first part is all about succinctness, it's basically about style, and the second part is essentially all about agreement. And there is also a great YouTube talk by Steve Pinker. You can just go home and Google communicating science and technology in 21st century, and basically just try to look for a talk given by Steven Pinker on scientific writing, and that'll help. These are the things that I recommend you to look up. And you also need to make sure that on top of writing things grammatically, you need to organize things properly. And pay particular attention to small words, even like and or but. Like they are simply conjunction words. Like you're not going to make a spelling mistake with and or but, right? But because they are traffic signs, like you're guiding your reader from one thought to another. And if you get the conjunctions wrong, you are going to create nonsense. Basically turning that simple right turn into something extremely complicated. And then you are inviting trouble for others to misunderstand. That is what I'm saying. Like with a small word like that, if you use it incorrectly, you are going to invite trouble. And then your reader is going to have question marks all over his head. And this entire talk basically invites me to rethink on this situation again, because we can be thinking of different things while we say the same thing, and we can be thinking of the same things when we talk about when we express differently. And even there can be real life situations like is he giving the finger, or is he just giving a gesture? Like, we can be looking at things at different angles, and this is a common problem in writing. So to solve this problem, I am reminded of, can we like, if we have a globe, we can look at things from various angles, and we know that this globe actually describes the entire map of the Earth, right? But if you can look at things from different angles and try to give the information as completely as possible, you might help others to understand, and you might write more effectively. And then I am prompted to ask, do we have a way to provide a panorama of the message that we want to express? In this case, probably we can, but because of our inherent limitations in writing, basically, if you have your globe and you take snapshots from one point of view to another, you're only going to create snapshots like this. And to your reader is going to look at the pictures that you describe, and the reader is going to say, oh, everything looks the same to me, but in fact they are not. And it's your job to clearly describe the differences of what you write, between things that you write to a reader. And that is what you're supposed to do in your writing. Basically, you should strive towards a holoscopic representation of your idea to make sure that others understand what you're trying to express as clearly as possible. Thank you.